often we speak to groups of managers saying, yeah, but then we need to train them, we need to do something different. And sometimes we even put it on them, that they are the ones responsible for having. And it's not always true, that's what I want to say. And it's not because I want to say the some and us and them and all of that. It's more because it's often because it's part of our culture. It's part of our culture. That suddenly the way we lead an organization does not always nurture this kind of leadership. I think you know as well, but I know of organizations where they're really training managers as well, but all levels in the organization on this, but somehow they still don't have it. And it's because they don't smell of it, right? It's the culture, it's not it, it's not it. So what we are borrowing from here right now, and that's what I'm going to introduce to you, is when we talk about participatory leadership, we talk about a kind of leadership through hosting and harvesting meaningful conversations, because the conversations becomes the driver. But it's the word meaningful that you should be attached to. So we know that if we can have any kind of group for whatever seems to be meaningful for them, then they will somehow engage. They will somehow, if you allow it, they might, if you create the conditions, also empower themselves. They might come to a state where they can really release the potential they're in. And if we're looking around ourselves these days, this is the time. It has been the time for a long time, I mean, centuries, but if there's any time where we need to release all the potential we have as human beings, it's now, I sense. And not only I think we all. And this is where we use these participatory approaches. We use them sometimes in windows, meaning we're coming into an organization and we work with them maybe for 2 months, 3 months. In that window, it seems quite participatory in what we're doing. The window might be a project or some project or program. And that does not necessarily change the culture. Then once in a while, I feel like that because I'm quite humble about what I do. I feel allowed sometimes to work in a longer period of time with an organization where you suddenly begin to sense that changing culture. That's also what we're aiming at, and suddenly you begin to have a different culture. So you can train them as much as you like, but unless the culture changes, it will not happen. So what is that culture? The best we could put to it is that we can begin to speak of that we are creating the conditions for a living system to be present. And it's interesting because inherent in each one of us, of course we are as a independent living system, each one of us. In us, we even have living systems that needs to work together in order to provide fully us. And if we look out the windows, even though it's winter still, we can't see the leaves, there's full of living systems out there. And we are part of one big living system. One of my mentors in this was Margaret Wheatley. I don't know if you know of her or know her, but Margaret wrote a book in the, I think it came out in 96, 95, I can't remember really, called Leadership in the New Science. She was from her background within biology, being highly interested in seeing what kind of impact do we know from living systems, of some systems of nature that actually, how do they lead, how do they organize ourselves? This was her journey. She had wrote a couple of years before a book called A Simpler Way. And it's almost poetry, that book, A Simpler Way, where leadership in the new science is close to a PhD, but it's interesting. Then A Simpler Way is almost poetry. That's really one of Bible or anything. It's just a book that I sometimes take out and readings through. She co-wrote it with Myron Rogers, I think. I'm not fully sure about that. I don't know him, I know her. In that book, she begins to speak about what are the natural preconditions for a living system to function. What is it that characterizes a living system? And these are the ones I'm going to introduce you. So just take them in, think of it. Think of, how can we nurture these conditions? Do we want to? Do we need to nurture these conditions? What can it bring us? Right? So I'm just putting that in. But it's also, I'm doing that also because it is somehow a part of the DNA behind Art of Hosting and behind participatory leadership. So it's not something you need to bow for or apply to, you decide, right? So just putting it in there. This is of course a living system being needing another living system. They need each other, these two, don't they? So, one of the things we know about a living system is that it accepts only its own solutions. It will never truly accept a solution where it has not been part of it. We saw you in the circle there, in the room. What was it you said? If we were creating it, we need to be the one on nutting it, right? Because that seems to be the part of it. And that's somehow the same here, right? So we also as human beings, and I see it often when I work with all kinds of groups. As a matter of fact, in the beginning when I started this work, I began to do that and use these methods because I had a client at that time saying, we have now for some years in our management team, it was what you call small and medium-sized company. We have been developing our strategy. And then when we have developed our strategy for the next 3 years in our management team, we are inviting the others 150 people into a full day, and we have a lovely dinner at evening, and sometimes they even have some kind of, performance in the evening. And as a part of that day, we're also telling them, we're informing them by a PowerPoint of how our strategy is going to be rolled out and what is your role in that, right? Wherever part of the company you're in. It doesn't never really seem to work for us, or we have seen it doesn't really work. We're always facing it in problems with implementation. That's what they told me. And I was working with them. And I said, well, are you willing to try something else? That was in the late 90s, and they were like, yeah. And almost like that because it was in Denmark. So they were like, yeah, let's try it out. So what we did is, I didn't promise them 100% implementation, and I didn't promise them that everyone was now going to co-create the strategy. I might have done that today, being a little bit more courageous. But I said, how about they at least give you 2 inputs? Input to creating the strategy. Secondly, when you have a sense of the strategy, instead of you making a rollout plan, maybe involve them in that part, at least because in that, on both tactical, operational level, they need to be involved anyway, don't they? And I said, yeah, let's test that out. So we had a process of them giving input, everyone, to the strategy was done, and then on a more tactical, especially operational level, they had more influence on that. That seemed to change the game. That seemed to change it. Once again, it learned me very early on in this work. We have a tendency to accept the solution that we at least have some kind of influence. We might not be in fully control, but we might be within our influence sphere. And there's 2 different spheres, control, influence. So that's important. And nature, same way. We have seen so many nature kind of projects. I don't know about Croatia. I've seen it in Denmark. I've witnessed it still in Belgium today. Never seems to work. When we want to straighten out this river, 20 years later the habitat is dead, and we say, well, maybe we should leave it where it was. Yeah, maybe we should leave it where it was. Anyway, a living system pays attention, only to what is meaningful here and now. In the extreme, a living system don't begin to plan ahead. It does not. It doesn't begin to think of, yeah, but maybe, yeah, I'm doing this and I'm a tree, but maybe I could also do this or that. No, it pays attention only what is meaningful to it, here and now. And I know we are different, we are human beings, and we are very different in a living system, but still, there is a tendency, unless it's meaningful, we don't really pay attention to it. We have unfortunately learned ourselves, trained ourselves, to pay attention to something that is not necessarily meaningful. We just asked a question here. Last week, how many meetings did you participate in? I don't need to know, but how many of these meetings was 100% meaningful for you, all of them? Right? I'm not stressing you or stressing myself. I'm just aware we have a tendency as professional grown-ups sometimes to accept the less meaningful. And then you can go back to yourself and put that in and see how that works for you. But often we also see a human being, if you really want some kind of some level of engagement, some level of empowerment, some level of ownership, ownership to something, you also need to make sure it's meaningful. It makes some kind of meaning to that person. All right. A living system will at all time participate, I should do it here actually. A living system will at all time participate in the development of its neighbor, right? The tree and the beehive. Tree and the beehive, and many, many, many other things. The tree and the fertile ground, the mushrooms, whatever. Wherever what you speak about in nature is, if a living system is on its own, it will be doomed. A solitary living system in nature for real will be doomed. It needs help, it needs support. Just look at the plant we take inside. If we don't help it and support it, make sure at least it is somewhere where there is sun, so it can develop, and there is water, it will die. It will die. I just bought one of these living systems in one of these glass balls that apparently from the dew that it creates could sustain itself. The tree just died. I don't know what I did there. Something I did wrong. I didn't water it. So I don't know. But that's what you speak about in nature. I think rightfully sometimes if we look at our organizations as a living system, often, at least what I'm hearing, is the biggest issues today is that we have created systems within our organizations where we have a hard time reaching out to others. We just saw it here before. I'm creating 4 groups, and the competitiveness of a few, especially one, makes it a little bit them and us, right? Have I asked the 4 of you to go to the 2 of them, to the 2 of them going with the 4 of them, then suddenly you'll be like, yeah, but why should I go with them now, right? There is a tendency, us in human beings, that we have, I don't know what it is, but we're really, really quick at creating a level of fragmentation and a level of isolation, and a level of us and them. And in the end of the day, most of my work comes in because we need to collaborate more. That's often what I'm hearing. We need to go more horizontal. We have gone many years of kind of flattening out, if needed, the vertical levels where needed. But now it's much more about horizontal work. How can we do that? Because it seems to be isolated. Oh wait, there's something about time here, I'm aware of that. Yeah, Blanca is looking at me. The only way that Blanca can look at you, then you know you need to speak up. A living system will be probing. A living system, a true living system, will not figure it out by a strategic plan and an analyzing process beforehand, and then say, this is what is the perfect solution, let's go for it. A true living system will probe. It will find out what works. It will take 3 steps ahead, half step behind, or even 3 steps behind, back again, not behind, back again. Right? It will probe. It will probe. And that's the way it develops. It finds out what works. It does not need what is optimal. No, sorry, it needs what is optimal and what will work for it, but not necessarily what is the perfect solution. It doesn't spend a lot of time on calculating out what is the perfect solution. If it works, it works. That's where it stops. And then I will end with this one. This one says it's in constant change. Yeah, I think we know. But I will end with this one and say a few words. A true living system, and this is where it comes in for us, where a kind of participatory leadership, I'm not saying the participatory leadership or anything, I'm just saying a kind of leadership that will allow a level of engagement towards what seems to be meaningful for us is needed, because a true living system cannot be controlled, it cannot be steered, it can only be nudged, it can be invited, it can be inspired, what you just said, it can be inspired to do something.